Metaphor ReFantazio is a sprawling 100-hour epic fantasy saga from Atlas Games, same makers of the Persona games and Shin Megami Tensei. Atlas's new IP, developed by Studio Zero, is an offbeat fantasy which subverts many common tropes of the fantasy genre and explores themes such as what makes a good leader, how anxiety affects people's lives, and what is the role of academia. And ultimately, the game asks the question, what role does fantasy play in our lives? What is fantasy? People may have differing concepts of what the genre is. Are fantasies meant to be metaphors for our lives? Do they exist for entertainment? Do they exist to provide escape from difficult lives? Are fantasies simply worlds which we have not yet encountered? The game itself seems unclear on the matter. There are spoilers in this video, so you can skip to the next section if you're not into that kind of thing. Fantasy plays a major role in the story of Metaphor ReFantazio. The game takes place in a fantasy world, but that's not to say they are strangers to fantasy themselves. The protagonist carries a book which portrays a utopic society in which people are all equal regardless of race or economic status, and are free to worship whatever gods they choose. A fantasy, if you will, as the actual world in the game is rife with racism and inequality. Certain races are treated like trash, and the poor are mere fodder for the ruling class. When the character dies in the game, instead of saying you died, the screen shows the words, "Fantasy is dead." What does that mean? It's very mysterious. There are several tribes of races, none of which are humans. In fact, in Metaphor ReFantazio, humans are monstrous creatures who come out of nowhere and destroy towns, and are a general threat to society. Like Attack on Titan meets those weird pictures from the margins in medieval manuscripts. The king has been murdered, and the prince has been put under a sleeping curse. He's a regular sleeping beauty, if you will. The major church wants to take control of the country, but so does an upstart military general, Luis. However, due to a spell from the royal family, in the event of the king's murder, there is instead to be a great race in which the role of the new king will fall to whoever the most people believe in. Thus begins an epic race for the throne, which not only the church and the military vie for control, but many other candidates as well. The protagonist, who cannot remember the past, is covertly working for the prince, and comes to believe that Luis is the cause for the prince's slumber, and killing him will end the curse. However, due to difficulty of accessing Luis, the protagonist decides to enter the race on behalf of the prince, though that is a secret. There are a number of twists and turns as the characters travel the land, winning people to their cause. At one point, the main characters even decide that in order to continue their claim for the throne, they're gonna have to lie to the public and tell them that the main character in the story is actually the prince himself, which people are willing to believe because very few people knew who the prince was. It's the olden days. Eventually, though, they do succeed in reviving the prince, though Luis remains alive, and then Luis kills the prince. And then, in a twist of fate, the characters learn that the protagonist is actually the prince, because he's the manifestation of all the hopes and dreams of the prince. And so then they join bodies. So the main character turned out to always have been the prince, and now he is the prince, and the campaign continues with him at the lie that he told was actually the truth, eventually leading to an ultimate fight with Luis. Throughout the game, the characters must battle with the warring ideologies of different candidates. The characters also interact with the world through relationships with various characters they meet along the journey, similar to many Persona games, and fulfilling quests and dungeon crawling and fighting monsters. Ultimately, the game is extremely dialogue heavy and functions the same as the Persona games, with possibly even more dialogue. There's actually far too much dialogue. Every day, every character seems to have to say something about the goals, the dungeon they just went on, how the journey is going, and so on. Most of the dialogue is extremely repetitive. There are many times when the characters over-explain their motives and the finer points of the fantasy world they're living in, leaving little to the imagination. There are several points in the games where you can literally spend several hours doing basically nothing but watching the characters have dialogue. In an over 100-hour game, more than half of it is spent reading or listening to dialogue. I really don't need that much information, and we definitely don't need every character's opinion on every little thing. The themes as well are very convoluted. There is not a clear stance on many of the questions raised. The magic system, for instance, is very convoluted and confusing. The game states that magic is created by people's anxiety, and too much magic turns people into humans, which are the big monsters, remember. And also, people's anxiety is harnessed by the royal family, who are simultaneously siphoning the magic energy from the general people and also protecting them from themselves from turning into humans. People's stance on mystical creatures is a bit odd as well. Magic is a fact of life in this world, but at one point, a character even claims that dragons are simply areas on the map we haven't been to yet, implying they don't really exist. But then, we go on to fight a physical dragon. The game seems to just disbelieve its own fantasy, as if the writers don't want their story to be true, despite them being the ones to write it. Leads to kind of a murky, unclear world where everything is just kind of weird. Perhaps the story is too self-aware for its own good. The visual style has a similar quality of being kind of intentionally muddled and hazy. Everything is made to look like you are standing in an impressionistic painting. Unfortunately though, the textures are not that high quality, and it all just kinda looks like a big mess. Though you can kinda see what they were going for, but you gotta play along and use your imagination here. The gameplay, first of all, is way too hard. The game is essentially just like the Persona games, but I had to turn the difficulty down after the first boss because it was just way too hard. And I didn't want to spend the next 100 hours of my time agonizing over every little choice my characters make in order to optimize every little thing. The difficulty comes primarily down to leveling, equipment, using strategies against tricky bosses. The strategies are the fun part though, but even on the lower difficulty, the game is still plenty difficult, and I died several times on the lower difficulty. There are a couple of major differences from the Persona games though. First of all, there is a new travel mechanic, where the player must travel around the map. Sometimes their journeys take multiple days and require camping. This travel planning aspect was a fun mechanic to plan around, as it added an aspect of travel which is missing in most adventure games. The characters travel around the map on a runner, which is like a giant part beast, part machine with a carriage on top thing, which runs around the countryside. Think Neon Genesis Evangelion with a carriage. Basically a land ship, which the characters can use as a main hub for the game. Same as the Persona games, the players get allotted a certain amount of time during which they can complete an objective. In this game, they also get a number of quests that they can complete in that time as well though. And there are the usual activities and relationship arcs that they can do as well. So the player must use their time efficiently. Dungeons almost always entail going somewhere on the map and completing a dungeon, so they usually take at least a day to get to them. Mostly they are generic, but there is a fun, adventure-y feel to them. They are usually not too long, but they are often very confusing to navigate. The main dungeons, on the other hand though, are longer and harder than the regular quest dungeons, and they will sometimes take multiple days to complete. So the player has to plan around that. It's another factor to consider during downtime planning. Different from the Persona games, There is a very complex class structure which the characters can adhere to. The game borrows from games like the older Final Fantasy games like 3, 4, and 5, where they have different jobs which affect their specific skills in battle. In Metaphor, the classes are called archetypes, and they can be learned with the help of an extra-dimensional ally named More. More is a being trapped in a pocket dimension called Academia. I think you can see what the connection is here. By entering Academia, the player can learn new archetypes, which gives them new skills to learn in battle. There is an emphasis on switching archetypes. Every character will have to learn multiple archetypes. Sometimes, certain archetypes also require ranks in other unrelated archetypes. It's ultimately a very confusing system, which probably will present the most difficulty to a new player trying to learn the game. Just as in the Persona games, the archetypes are very cleverly designed, and they offer unique abilities, though often not what you'd expect, and not always ideal for what you're going for. The game allows the player to freely explore the archetypes and try out different builds for their team. However, near the end of the game introduces a final 4th tier of archetypes, Royal Archetypes. Each character has a unique Royal Archetype they can learn. Annoyingly, these Royal Archetypes have very strict requirements which require certain ranks in certain other archetypes. Ultimately, this means that though the player had free choice to choose what they wanted to allocate the ranks to throughout the game, there was really one optimal build for each character, and if you stray too far from that build, you may be unable to achieve their final tier of Royal Archetype. And the game only reveals these archetypes and their requirements near the end. So it's essentially an illusion of choice. And just like in the Persona games, the creators just seem to like to find ways to punish players for making choices that they give them the option to take, and not know that they're doing it wrong until it's too late. However, the game does give a lot of leeway in choosing archetypes, so for most players it probably won't be an issue. I'm just saying. Metaphor ReFantazio is a messy epic from the creators of the Persona games. It has a unique and thoroughly fleshed out world, and offers new mechanics, many of which are great and innovative. It is a difficult and messy experience as well though, but it might fill a niche for certain fans of RPGs in the fantasy genre.